Take a seat.
To recap, we want to turn the focus a little bit to the future. And I posed the question that both Mr. Tan See Peng and Peter Lim had asked. And I want to add on to that a quote from Dr. Linda Lim. She was interviewed in the Straits Times on March 11th. And this is what she said. For the last 40 years, Singapore has viewed itself as an outpost of the Western Empire, catering to those scared of the jungle and needing an intermediary. Frankly, no one comes here to go to India or to China. No point trying to be a gateway when people can go there directly. So that's what she said in the interview. In a nutshell, she is saying that our old model may not work anymore. Investments could flow directly into neighboring countries, which are all trying hard to attract investors. What do you think, Mr. Chan? Is this true? Have we become irrelevant? Why do people still need Singapore? Why would they still listen to the EDB pitch? What do we offer today? And how should we approach our work going forward?
Well, David, let me just preface the remarks by telling you that I have been offline to EDB for the last 15 years. So, unfortunately, in this business of international investment, if you're offline even 15 months, you're not in touch already because things change so fast. You need almost a daily basis of contact with investors to be able to figure out how they think, what they think, how they act, how they're going to decide, and so on. So maybe I may not be in a good position to tell you that as my current colleagues who are running EDB today, because they got their finger on the pulse better than I.
But you have a different perspective, right?
That doesn't mean that, I have no thoughts about it. So I do have some thoughts about
We needn't have worried.
I do have some thoughts about it, particularly since I go back to EDB, and from time to time run their induction programs. The induction programs are the programs where, our scholars, our best and brightest come back, and they are all very, very, very book smart, but they may not be so street smart. So one of the EDB programs actually is to try and, develop a balance for these officers so that they can be both book smart as well as street smart. And this keeps me on my toes sometimes, you see.
Well, as a short aside, tell us one short story about what being street smart is for the benefit of the young ones here today.
What story?
Give us one story on what it's like to be street smart.
Well, okay, I'll try to make it brief, but I go back to the beginning of my remarks, which is, that, people learn mass production when they launch into industrialization by going into auto, and they also go into consumer electronics. Yep. Consumer electronics.
Yep.
US has done it, Japan has done it, China is doing it now. There's both auto and consumer electronics. So this is my street smart story. I don't know whether it fits your definition nicely or not. But, when we go visiting, when our team in the US, and you are one of them, when we go visiting, when the company is more than 500 miles away, we catch a plane and we go. But when it's less than 500 miles, we drive. So the typical SOP is, we would drive, check ourselves into a hotel, go up to our room, and then run down to the coffee shop, catch a dinner or something like that, and then come back thinking that, we'll do some reading for tomorrow's meetings. And while you are doing all of this, before you go to bed, you set the radio alarm clock next to your bed. And typically the radio alarm clock is the best and most primeval example of American consumer electronics. The clock radio that you find on your bedside, where you set your alarm clock to help you wake up. So, but when we do this, all of us started to notice that all the clock radios in the room, used to be made by GE. And then after a while, no more GE, made by some Taiwan company, some Japanese company, and so on, because they have, this is not a good story to tell for America, because this is a story to show how America has lost one whole industry. The consumer electronics industry is completely lost to America. In 1955, I checked some statistics. In 1955, 90% of clock radios and other types of radios were made in America by Americans. Right. 10 years later, 1965, it was down to 30%. And another 10 years later...
Well, it's not just the radios. I think they've stopped making a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, and in 1975, the thing is zero.
Yeah.
So how is all of this street smart? So we look at that and we conclude that American consumer electronics industry was going kaput, and that, somewhere along the line, they have to do something if they're interested in actually maintaining a position in their industry. Yeah. So starting from that observation of the clock radio by our bedside when we check into the hotels, I zeroed into a subsidiary of GE called GE Consumer Electronics, which makes those radios. And consumer electronics during that time were just radios and tape recorders. Nothing to do with notebooks, PCs, cell phones or what. So we zeroed in on that. So I started chasing the project, started chasing GE for that particular project to make clock radios in Singapore. We thought that would be a viable project for Singapore. And then my friend who ran the operation, his name is Bill Bond, he said, Mr. Chan, you're too late. I said, why am I too late? He says, we have just opened a huge clock radio plant in Hong Kong. So I said, is that so? But maybe you can expand into Singapore. You don't want to be vulnerable to one line of supply, because they export everything back to the United States, you see. So you don't want to. He says, yeah, we can think about it. And then I didn't hear from Bill Bond, for about 6 months or so. Then one morning, I got a phone call from him and said, can we talk about that in the radio plant in Singapore? I said, of course. What's happened? He said, well, you know what happened? The Red Guards have started coming to Hong Kong, he said. It's a cultural revolution. The Red Guards are coming, and my people are saying to me, Bill, please make sure it may be a simple clock radio that you're producing, in Hong Kong, but it's many, many millions of dollars for GE as a dominant market player in that product segment. So he says, you must ensure your supply line from Hong Kong to the US. So Bill Bond says the best way I can ensure that supply line is by having another source of production. And since he has been talking to Singapore, he decided actually to do these GE clock radios in Singapore.
So that's how the radios came here? So that's how GE radios came to Singapore?
That's how GE radios came to Singapore.
And that all started by looking at your clock?
They had this huge plant they had this huge plant in Ang Mo Kio.
Right. Okay, so that's a lesson for the young ones. Next time you go to sleep, notice what's on the table before you fall asleep. And maybe some idea will strike you. But we come back now to that digression, because you said it's not just about having smart people, it's also having street smart people. But you were going to give us your thoughts about the future, how to stay relevant to the MNCs.
Well, the thing is this, you see, as I made a remark earlier and say, it's not what we want, it's what people need. So if you look at a scenario today, and I don't know how actually we're going to actually how we're going to articulate this in Singapore, because, and I keep on thinking that actually our strongest point, in this scenario that I see is our tripartism program, our tripartite cooperation between government, employers, and labor. Unfortunately, my friend Lim Swee Say is not here because he's overseas, but if he were here, I would have told him the same thing, that he's got to do something about it. The thing is this, that that for Singapore especially, the whole thing is shifting, and the whole paradigm is shifting. We must not think in terms of, foreign investments coming into Singapore only from the point of view of, the low end of the labor. That means, the one end of the supply chain, the one end of the value chain rather. Because if you look at the business value chain, there is the manufacturing end, which is the low end. There is the middle level, which is the management, which is all our old HQs. And incidentally, somebody came up now and say, you got the initial wrong. O doesn't stand for overseas. O stands for operation.
Yes.
So it's operational headquarters. And then they tell me that actually there is a huge program that started in Delco Remy, because the 7,000 MNCs that have OHQs in Singapore now have a total business spending, we call it TBS in EDB shorthand, total business spending of more than 7 billion Singapore dollars. Now, how do you get one plant or several plants to come to Singapore to produce total business spending of $7 billion? But here is this program, not something that we wanted, but came anyway, and we developed on it, and now we have 7,000 MNCs captive in Singapore with OHQs that produce $7 billion.
Take a seat.